Forest pollinators. In the past, the forest was the natural habitat of bees. It was man who, in the second half of the 17th century, brought the honeybee from the forests to the vicinity of his home, making it a domesticated animal. Due to its pollination of many crops and wild plants, the honeybee is an insect of crucial importance both to the economy and to nature itself. Bees contribute to food production, and by mediating pollination of many wild plant species, they are crucial to the preservation of genetic resources in natural ecosystems. The value of the ecosystem services related to bees is enormous and can hardly be overestimated. The annual economic value of insect pollination in Europe has been estimated at over 14 billion euros. At present, populations of pollinating insects are shrinking rapidly, and this is a problem not only in Poland but also worldwide. In recent years, there has been a decline in bee populations in many regions of the world. As a result of careless human activity, more species are dying. Unfortunately, this is already having an impact on our economic performance. The observed process of a reduction in the population of pollinators and primarily of bees has a very unfavorable impact on the environment. After all, these insects provide us with our daily diet and ensure the diet of many living organisms. They are also responsible for the health of all these organisms. One of the main reasons for the disappearance of pollinators and the deterioration in their health is the presence of toxic substances in the agricultural environment. The use of chemical plant protection products has doubled in the last decade. All chemical compounds used in agriculture can be found in crop pollen. Accumulation of several agents, for instance fungicides with insecticides and herbicides, increases their toxicity. More and more often this is lethal for pollinating insects, and it certainly weakens them considerably and makes them more susceptible to diseases and pathogens. A chemical-free forest environment seems to be one of the few chances for pollinating insects to survive and improve their health at the same time. Honeybees are well adapted to life in forest ecosystems. Under natural conditions, they build their nests in hollows and can therefore find numerous nesting sites in forests. Most native bee species nest in the ground. Nests built above ground are set up in plants, for instance in the blades of reeds, stems of herbaceous plants, or shrubs with a soft pith, such as blackberries. Pollinators also choose places to live in decaying or dry wood, for example in stumps or logs. There are many species that can be found in the forests, especially in such overexposed forests on forest edges, in crops along sandy roads. Among the few we could mention is the grey-backed mining bee, Andrena vaga, which appears quite early as the end of February, in March, and establishes such underground colonies. The pollen for the larvae is willow pollen, while the bee visits the flowers, feeds on nectar, and thus contributes to the pollination of plants. A very interesting species, but much rarer in Poland in our forests, is the two-colored mason bee, Osmia bicolor, which uses the shells of snails for nests, and these are mainly larger snails, namely Roman snails. And the female lays an egg in such a shell and brings food. She can lay up to 2 eggs, but usually it's 1. And to protect the offspring, she covers the shell with plant material, for instance needles or leaves. There are also species which can be found in late summer, such as the heather colites, Colites succinatus, which likes to visit heather flowers, and it appears here in August and can be found as late as the beginning of September. It also likes such warm places, sandy roads where it makes nests and gathers food for its larvae. They complement each other perfectly when it comes to pollination, because we also know that different plants bloom at different times, and there will always be some pollinating insects. On the 20th of May 2018, for the first time, we celebrated World Bee Day, established by the United Nations. This is an initiative to draw our attention to the great importance of these insects for the global economy and food production. In the same year, the state forests launched the project Bees Are Returning to the Forest. The project concerns not only the honeybee Apis mellifera, but also over 460 species of wild bees that can be found in Poland. The state forests want to protect bees by increasing the share of melliferous plants in forests, as well as by rational use of forests for the needs of beekeeping. The Bees Returning to the Forest project began with a diagnosis of whether honeybees, which are the easiest to observe, have a sufficient food base by living in apiaries near the forest and thus deriving a large part of their food from the forest. The research was based on a network of apiaries monitoring food resources of bees in different forest environments throughout the country. Based on questionnaires sent out, 104 apiaries run by foresters, beekeepers, were selected. The main criterion for selection was the largest possible proportion of forest area within a 2-kilometer radius. The apiaries were equipped with electronic apiary scales, which automatically provided daily information about the weight of the hive placed on the scale, as well as additional information about the temperature and humidity inside the nest. We are at the beehive which has been placed on the apiary scale taking part in the project. This scale takes measurements 3 times a day. The data is collected automatically and sent remotely to a server, where it is further analyzed and will be used for scientific research. Using a special smartphone application, foresters' beekeepers provided additional information from phenological observations, that is, about the flowering dates of melliferous plants, as well as about the work carried out in the apiary. A very important element of our observations was data from floristic observations. Each apiary within a 2-kilometer radius of a given location was required to monitor the blooming and declining of the main melliferous plants. All this data was collected in order to develop the bee food base in the forest areas. And in fact, the fluctuation of this base, that is, the distribution of forage in particular months, so that we know what the forage gaps are, so that later on, in the recommendations for forest practice, in our instructions, be it forest protection or principles of silviculture, we can fill in these gaps, introducing mainly biosynotic undergrowth species in order to secure food in these most difficult periods for all pollinators. This knowledge will allow the creation of a list of plant species for each forest habitat type that will provide food resources for bees during the entire growing season in a forest environment that is not yet contaminated with chemicals. Another important outcome of this project will be the development of recommendations for instructions regulating forest management. The research has now ended. It lasted 2 years, but it will probably continue. The effect of scale we obtained is also amazing, because it is 1/3 of Poland's area. We can be proud of this knowledge. There was no such research previously. Planting trees and bushes that increase the food base for pollinating insects in forests is therefore now a key task for foresters in conducting bee-friendly forest management. And it is possible to plant, for example, on areas underneath power lines that cross forests. Such areas belonging to the state forests cover over 16.5 thousand hectares. Proper management of ecotones, that is, the transitional zones between various ecosystems, and the recreation and maintenance of mid-forest meadows is bee-friendly. Mid-forest meadows, such as the one we are on now, are very valuable parts of forest ecosystems. They are an excellent food base for all pollinators. It is therefore worth caring for such meadows and protecting them from natural succession. The bees returning to the forest project also involves promoting beekeeping among foresters themselves. Forest apiaries increase the potential of pollinators affecting the forest environment. It is interesting to know where the Polish name pasieka, apiary, comes from. It is connected with the fact that it is well known that beehive logs, or beehive trees, were the property of beekeepers, while the land where the trees grew or the beehive logs were hung belonged to the ruler of the area. And as a form of protest, when the Congress Kingdom of Poland moved the bees out of the forest areas, the forest beekeepers chopped down, or there used to be a word, pasiekali. So they chopped down these trees and took them to their home apiaries, and that's why now we say that someone has pasieki, apiaries. My stationary apiary is 300 meters from a forest with fir trees. However, fir does not always produce honeydew all over the forest. Often it is spot honeydew. I have a forestry lease agreement with the forest district for the time when this spot honeydew is present. I can set up an apiary. In such an agreement there is a location and a map where I can place the apiary, and I use it when necessary. On the one hand, the state forests promote beekeeping among their employees, while on the other hand, they somehow reactivate forest beekeeping that was a natural phenomenon in forests not so long ago. Forest beekeeping played a very important role in the Kozienice forest. This is evidenced by the granting of the forest beekeeping law and privilege of jedlnia by kings. The importance of forest beekeeping is also evidenced by the names of villages located around the Kozienice forest, such as Jedlnia Królewska and Bartodzieje. Over a dozen years ago, an initiative was taken to restore forest beekeeping in Poland, among others as part of a project carried out in the Spała and Koneck forests. Working with bees that inhabit tree trunks requires knowledge and experience, which is why it was once, as now, carried out by a small group of people called forest beekeepers. If we start our adventure with forest beekeeping, it is worth choosing a place for bees before we ask the forester or district forester where we can act or do anything. The first condition for the well-being of bees in the forest is an appropriate food base. You have to look whether there are lime trees around, or thickets of willows, raspberries or blackberries. This is fundamental. The second thing is a source of water. The third thing is a suitable tree so that you can make a wild beehive in it. And if there is no such tree, then a beehive log is the last resort. Such a log can be installed. If we already have such a place selected and we know where to locate the wild beehive or the log, it's also worth looking at the forest in the immediate vicinity, because, as we know, bees like the forest and warmth. It's good if the place is exposed to light and quiet. It is worthwhile that the wild beehive is not made too low, preferably at least 4 to 5 meters above the ground, so that the bees do not feel the humidity, which in the forest is near the ground. In the past, forest beekeepers made their hives at a height of 10 to 11 meters. Today, there is no need for this. The barrier of 4 to 5 meters is enough for the bees to do well. Do you know the difference between a beehive log and a wild beehive? No. A wild beehive is a bee house in a tree, whereas a beehive log is a part of a tree in which it is possible to make a bee house. And here we are going to make such a room for the bees in the log. It will be a beehive log for the future. We are doing it in such a way that this log will stand, so that you can learn how to make wild beehives in trees later on. In general, there are 2 exits. One is an elongated one. It's called a log hole. This is an opening for the forest beekeeper to be able to take out the honey. There is also another opening, which is called an eyelet, and through this eyelet the bees fly in. We help ourselves with the sawing machine. We start with the saw, and there we go. More and more often in our forests, in addition to boxes for birds, dormice or bats, you will find such boxes for the honeybee. The model for this box was developed by Professor Adam Kopielski of the University of Agriculture in Kraków. This model can be found in the recommendations for forestry practice entitled Forest Beekeeping as a Form of Protection of Wild Honeybee Colonies in Forests. Forest beekeeping is therefore returning to the forests with the main task of increasing the nesting sites of wild bees and the overall number of pollinators in forest ecosystems. This return also has a cultural and educational dimension. Education plays a very important role in raising awareness of the need to protect pollinating insects. The state forests carry out many such activities, especially for the youngest. We are now at the forest nursery in Przejazd, near the educational trail called Śródborze. Recently, the so-called bee green plot was created, and today we present here plants connected with insects. That is, honey plants and also houses which we make for insects. I am holding sticks in my hand which are made for a mason bee. Recently, we have seen a lot of interest in this activity, among others. That is why such a place, which we call a bee campsite, here at the nursery perfectly fulfills its function. There is also a fantastic education, because even by putting up such a little hotel in the garden, preferably with children, we teach them that insects are important to us, that insects should not be feared. Here, every education is of great importance. Insects are neglected in schools, despite the fact that we have over 26,000 species in Poland, which is more than all the other organisms put together. Disproportionately little time is devoted to them, and they are often omitted. I have observed from our educational activities that children are not afraid to take insects into their hands, while their guardians are. Children give them names by which they get rid of such a fear of insects, and at the same time you can also tell them, smuggle information, how many insects are useful. If we consolidate this, we have a chance that when these children grow up, one day they will look at insects in a completely different way. As a result, the situation of pollinating insects, perhaps also bees, will also improve even more. The apiary season is over. It is a moment of rest for bees and beekeepers. Also, the project has ended and we can summarize it. It has brought us a lot of knowledge which we can use on a really large scale. The first important element was to recognize the honey-growing potential of the forest and to strengthen it. The establishment of beekeeping studies at the University of Agriculture in Kraków was a very good move. Thanks to the fact that so many people participated in the project, we could learn a lot of things. First of all, that we have so many fellow foresters beekeepers, but also, on the basis of these studies throughout Poland, to determine the conditions in which bees live. And on this basis of the honeybee as a representative of pollinators, we can apply this knowledge to other pollinators. We are witnessing a great mass extinction of species and a drastic decline in biodiversity on a global scale. Populations are dying and ecosystems are collapsing or evolving. We know that nearly 90% of all flowering plants need the participation of pollinators to set seed. Almost 80% of land plant species need bees to survive and reproduce. The survival of most current life forms is impossible without the contribution of this group of insects. Fortunately, we seem to have grasped how much we are endangering life on Earth by our decisions, endangering ourselves. However, will we as humans use this knowledge, and will we have enough time to reverse this negative phenomenon? Foresters in Poland are certainly making their own small contribution to this great task of repairing the planet and are implementing specific measures to bring bees back into the forests.
Fraszka na grudzień.
Epigram for December 1618, Ryszyński. When the bear was led to the honey, then his ears were ripped off, and when from the honey, then his tail. Love has the taste of honey, which even a bee can skillfully extract from flowers. Sweet honey, sweet sugar, and the sweetest of all, a kind word.